Welcome to Shambhala, Seawind 1000. Today, as you can see, we're not on the boat, we're actually in my garage at home. I bought two new, to me, 9.9 Yamaha high thrust motors, and today I'm going to service one of them. One of them I've already had serviced professionally, and I've installed it on the boat to replace the one that blew up. And if you saw the last video, you would have seen that. This one is also going to go on the boat, so I have two matching motors, and I'm going to service it myself, and I thought I'd just pop a video in my next video showing how you can service these motors yourself. It's not that difficult. There's a few little tips and hints that that some people might find interesting. You may already service your own motors, but if you don't, then this will show you how it can be done. So these are the parts that we're going to need to service the motor. First off, spark plugs. So for the 9.9 Yamaha motor that I have, which is a 2009 model, it's the NGK BR6HS10, which means it's a 1mm gap, which is what's required for this particular motor. We're going to put a new impeller in. Always replace the impeller. You should do it every 12 months, even if your motor is still pumping water well, but replacing the impeller is a really good idea. We're going to replace the oil. Now this is, as you can see, Honda oil, not Yamaha oil. However, they didn't have any Yamaha oil at the shop. It's the same stuff, just Honda brand rather than Yamaha. There are a couple of things we need to also replace. We have a couple of O-rings here which will go in the gearbox seals, the drain seals for the gearbox. We're going to change the gearbox oil as well. Now I'm also replacing the thermostat on this particular motor. As you can see on this one, it's in pretty poor condition, and there's some damaged rubber there as well. So I've tested it. It's working, but I'd rather replace it anyway. The thing is with these motors is that they rarely get flushed after use, so things like these thermostats can get quite dirty and grubby. So there's the new thermostat. Not a cheap part. That's a $100 thermostat, that, which is very expensive for a boat thermostat, but it's also better than blowing your motor up by overheating. So let's crack on with it. Okay, so I've removed the cowling from the top. You can also see that I've removed the cover from the flywheel, which normally sits on here, and there's also another cover that sits on here. So I've removed those covers, and now I'm just going to remove the spark plugs. So these particular spark plugs are a 13/16 or a 21mm plug socket. Pop off the spark plug leads, and this might be telling some people how to suck eggs when you're removing a spark plug, but now one thing you need to be very careful with spark plugs on any vehicle, because they can get damaged. Now that's the internal part of the plug lead that's popped off there, so I'm going to have to repair that, pop that back in there, otherwise that's not going to work very well. Yes, be very careful that when you're removing these, that you don't go the wrong way and over tighten them. So to remove them, we're going anti-clockwise. Okay, so just, they shouldn't be too tight. If they're too tight, you can strip the thread. So just do them up by hand to start with, and then just nip them up a little bit with your socket once you're ready to replace them. Now you can see that that's quite rusty. Okay, so that's had quite a bit of salt corrosion. Internally, it's not too bad, but there is rust around the seal as well. So always good to replace spark plugs when you're doing a service. Don't leave them simply because the motor's running properly. don't get much room in here to get a socket in. Let's see if I can get that in there. No. So what I'm going to need to do is with this particular spark plug socket, I can get a spanner to slip over that. Okay, so I've got a little wrench here that I can put over the top, a little spanner that fits. Now if you don't have that particular hex part on your plug spanner, then you may be able to use a flexible extension on your socket to get in there. This one's a little bit stiff. Okay, so that one's a bit rusty as well, but internally they look okay. A little bit black, but that's the way they should be. Okay, so the new spark plug and the old spark plug, this is, yep, the correct plug was in there before, which is good to know. Also down here on the motor, I don't know if you can see that on camera, but it tells you what spark plug it requires underneath the fuel pump here. Okay, putting the new plug in, make sure you don't cross thread it. So you want to be able to put it in with your fingers to get it started, to ensure that it doesn't cross thread and strip the thread out. Okay, so that's now started and I can turn it in by hand. Okay, so make sure you turn it a few turns by hand first, and then you'll feel it if it's cross threaded. It won't go in properly. So put both of these, start both of these by hand before we tighten them up. Okay, they're both started now. I'll just turn them up until we get to the end of the thread and you can feel that they seat in. Okay, so we're just going to wind them in by hand. Don't do it with a spanner. As I said, if it's cross threaded, you'll notice. If you do it with a spanner, you won't be able to feel that it's tight, and you may well strip or cross thread it, and then you'll have a problem getting your plugs in and out, and you'll have to get the head re-tapped. Okay, so now we've got both of them done up finger tight. With this bottom one, I'm just going to get the spanner on it, and I'm just going to wind it on a little bit. Now what you want to do is you want to actually compress this washer that's in there. Needs to compress just a little bit, which just seals it. You don't want to overdo that. It's a bit difficult with this spanner to feel what's going on. Okay, so that's just tweaked up now with the socket. Pop that on there, and you just want to, you will feel it get to a point where you can feel that the washer has compressed. It's quite easy to turn, and then now it's quite solid. So that's all you want to do, just tweak it up a little bit. Okay, I've done some further investigation on this plug lead that was damaged, and inside the rubber boot I've found a piece of a broken plastic that obviously is broken off there. So that's going to hold everything together. So I'm going to get some epoxy and glue this back together. It's plastic, it should be okay, and we'll see if I can get this plug salvaged. Okay, so I've already drained the oil on this, but what I'm going to do now is replace the sump screw washer, because they are a consumable. It's a compression washer. So if you don't replace it, you could get leaks. Just make sure there's no more oil in there. Now I wasn't sure when this motor was actually last serviced, having bought it second hand. So I did drain the oil, and the oil was in quite good condition, so I suggested it probably wasn't changed all that long ago. Now let's get my torch, because the washer didn't come off with the screw. So I'm assuming it must be in here, or perhaps there wasn't one on it. I certainly can't see one in there, and there's not one on the bolt. So, one little washer. Pop that in there. And again, this is something you don't want to over tighten, so wind it in by hand to make sure that it doesn't cross thread. So that's going in nice and easy. So just tweak it up. Not too hard. You just want it to seat home so that the oil doesn't leak out. Okay, so the specs for this motor tell us that it's 1 litre of oil. So I'm just going to leave a little bit in the bottle, and then check the dipstick and see what the level is. Give it a little bit of time to drain down before you do this. So at the moment that's showing quite full. So it's not over full. Now it's probably a bit hard to see on there. That's our level there, where we need it to be, and that's where it's sitting at the moment. What I'll do is, after I run the motor and warm it up, let the oil pump through, then I'll check it again and top it up if it needs it. Now, one of the other things that we probably should replace on this is the fuel filter. This particular fuel filter is an inline one, so you've got 2 clamps, one on each end. It does have a direction of flow, and that will usually be marked on your fuel filter. But basically, the fuel comes in from the connection here at the end of the motor, where your fuel line goes in and runs in this direction. So in this case, this will have an arrow on it showing the direction of travel of the fuel. Just make sure you have that around the right way, so it's got to be pointing this direction. Okay, what we're going to do now is drain the gearbox oil. Now, I said before, the engine oil was in very, very good condition. It looked like it had been serviced fairly recently, but I'm not going to risk that, that the gearbox was done. So we've got a drain hole at the bottom here, and we have an oil level at the top here. If you leave this oil level screw in place when you undo the bottom one, you won't get too much oil coming out. So it's a very large screwdriver. And when I undo this, you can see we don't get much oil coming out in a hurry. Once I undo this top screw, we should get a bit of oil coming out. There you go. Actually, you can see it is a bit dirty. Alright, now that could be an indication of a couple of things. It may well have not been replaced for some time, or it might be that it's getting some water in through a seal somewhere. So I'm going to drain that out. I will lower the leg down so that it drains better, and then we'll replace it. Okay, so I've drained the lower unit oil, or the gearbox oil. You can see there's a little bit of milkiness in there, and that indicates that that there's been some water get in it. I'm not too worried about it. Sometimes the seals that are on these two holes, this hole and the drain hole, can leak a little bit of water in. But what I will do when I change the impeller, and we take this lower unit off, is I'm going to check the seal underneath the water pump. So yeah, not too much of a concern, but certainly if it's much more milky than this, then you have a leak somewhere in one of the seals, and you will need to replace those seals. What I'll do with this one is I'll fill it up with clean oil. I'm going to let this drain overnight, and I'll fill it up with clean oil, and after I run it for a while, I'll check it and just make sure that it's not milky again. And if it is, then we're going to have to do some work on it. Okay, while we're waiting for that gearbox oil to drain, I'm going to give this thermostat housing a bit of a clean out. As you can see, it's got a bit of corrosion in there. What I'll do is give it a clean as best as I can, and then I'm going to run some hot water through it, see if we can get it to drain out and clear some of that corrosion out. There's not a lot you can do about the internals of it. Perhaps put some corrosion cleaner in there and let it soak, but so these motors that are left on catamarans tend to not get flushed very often, so consequently we get a bit of corrosion in there. Okay, I've given that a clean out, and I've sprayed in some rust and stain remover, which is basically oxalic acid, and now I'm going to put some boiling water down through it. And all the boiling water is going to do is, if there is any residual salt in there in the cooling system, it's going to dissolve that salt. Probably should have put something on the ground to catch that with, I would imagine. That's better. Okay, let's put a little bit more through. So it's running through the cooling system and out the telltale, so the only part it's not running through is the intake, but we'll give that a clean out anyway once we remove the impeller. Okay, so we've got the new thermostat installed. The top for the thermostat cover has the old gasket on it. Is still in very good condition, so I'm just going to leave that on there because, again, the shop didn't have the part I needed. It's something I'll need to keep an eye on when we give it a test run to make sure that it's still sealing nicely, but I don't see any reason why it wouldn't. So we're just going to pop the screws back in there. Okay, so we've drained all of the gearbox oil out of here. Now, I didn't have the correct adapter for a Yamaha motor to fill this up, but the Honda one that I have has the pump and a hose, so I've made up an adapter just with a piece of plastic tubing, and this hose will fit over there quite nicely. So all I need to do now is lower the motor down, and I'm going to pump the oil in until it starts coming out the top here. Once it starts coming out the top, I'll put that top seal back in, and then I can remove the hose from the bottom and put the bottom one in without the oil draining out. So let's just lower this motor down and we'll get started. Okay, new seal on the screw to make sure that we don't get any water in. And all I'm going to do now is just pump this oil up. Now, it doesn't take a lot. You saw what came out of it before, but we will see it eventually coming out this oil fill level line. Now, if you don't have one of these pumps, it kind of makes things a little difficult. Okay, so there we are. We have oil coming out the top now. So we put the top screw in. A little bit of oil comes out when you remove the fitting for the pump, but we can now see that it's not coming out very fast at all, so I'm just going to do both of those up tight, and that's our gearbox oil full. So when you're doing these gearbox oil changes, you can see here that this has a threaded piece on the end of it that goes into our oil fill hole. This one is actually for a Mercury motor. So when you go to the shop and you buy your oil pump, see if you can find one that has adapters for each motor. I have a plastic tube here that I can pretty much force thread into there, which is what I did to fill this gearbox up. But if you can find one for the correct motor, it makes things a lot easier. Okay, now we're going to remove the lower leg of this Yamaha 9.9. In here we have our gear shift selector. We put that into reverse or in neutral. We can undo these two nuts here. Now, once you put it in reverse or neutral, make sure you don't shift it on the gear lever or on the shaft before you reinstall it. If you do that, then when you put it back together, it could be in the wrong gear. So that's just something to remember. So leave it in the position it is when you remove it. Now you can see there is a nut here and it's threaded. Now it's also adjustable. So take note of how much thread you have sticking out of this particular bolt here, this shaft, so that you know when you put it back together that you're roughly around the same, so the gear selector works correctly. Now to undo this, you're going to need two 10mm open end sockets, open end spanners I should say. One goes on the shaft and the other one goes on this nut here, and just undo that. And once you've got that undone, you should be able to take this one all the way off. If you do have to put it in neutral to get in reverse to get this one off, that's fine. Just remember to leave it in reverse. Right, once you've done that, 12mm socket on these bottom legs. I've already loosened this one off. There are 4 of these, 2 on this side, and there's 2 on the other side as well. So we're going to take these off all the way. Now we're going to split this right here. Okay, so these are the only nuts that we need to undo, apart from our gear selector nut. Okay, once we've got those 4 off, then we can pull our bottom leg out. Make sure you catch these washers. Okay, so we've got to undo this all the way until it comes off our gear selector here. And then we can pull our lower unit out. This adjuster nut here for our gear shift lever needs to come all the way off before we can pull this bottom leg out. Okay, and this is your lower unit. You have the housing here for your impeller, your water pump, and this is the drive shaft. Okay, so what we're going to do now is remove that water pump housing and replace the impeller. Okay, let's check out this impeller. So we've got 4 12mm bolts on top of the water pump, which we need to remove. Okay, 4 bolts removed. Now we've got to crack the seal on this, and we're going to slide it up out. Okay, so that exposes our impeller. So you can see this impeller is not in very good condition. It's kind of bent out of shape. There's no broken fins or anything on it, but it is a bit bent out of shape, and it certainly does need a clean. Now when we lift the impeller off, we can just slide it up. Let's get a screwdriver to get underneath it. Now the impeller has a keyway in it. Okay, so there will be a key in here that you make sure you do not lose. Okay, so there is the key here. You can see it just in there. And Impeller is very sticky because it's muddy. So this is why we check the impeller every 12 months. And you know, if you've got a chance to service your motor more often, certainly to get all of this mud out of it, because you really don't want this mud going through the system. And this mud also ends up going up through the rest of the motor. Okay, so let's give this a bit of a wipe down so we can see what we're working with. See, there's a bit of mud in there. There's actually no oil in there, which means that that oil seal underneath there is probably okay. Okay, I'm just going to give this a bit of a clean up. Want to make sure we get rid of all that mud. Okay, so we've given everything a good clean up. Now we're going to put this impeller back on again. Notice it has a slot here for the key to go in. Okay, so that it goes that way up, not that way up. Sorry, that way to the bottom. So I'm just going to slide it down. Make sure we get it in the right place for the key and slot it straight in. Everything's had a good clean. And now we can put the water pump housing back on again. Now it has a locator pin, okay, which locates on these two. Alright, so we make sure we have it the right way around with those two pinholes going forward. Now as we lower the impeller down, we're going to rotate it clockwise so that the impeller blades fit in to the housing. And there we go. We're on target. Make sure you put these retainers back on. They keep the pressure down because there is no gasket on these water pumps. It's just a rubber pump. So these keep the pressure on the sides so that we don't get any leaks. And that's how simple it is to replace an impeller. So that's our impeller replaced. We should have a good strong water pump now. Okay, time to replace our lower leg unit. I've put a bit of grease on the spline of the drive shaft there, so that when we put it up into its slot, it will be nice and lubricated. Now this can be somewhat tricky. Two things you've got to make sure: that you line up your drive shaft correctly, and also up here there is the water pump feed tube that needs to go inside this rubber slot. Now you can really only do it with your fingers just to feel where it's going to go in. And then just check before you push everything home that everything is connected correctly, and then hopefully, all going well, we'll slide into the drive shaft. Now what you can do is, at the moment we've got it in the correct position, but it's not going in. If you rotate the gearbox a little, you might need a pair of pliers or some multi-grips to do so. And if you've got a propeller on, it's a bit easier. Just rotate it a little bit and you'll see that it's now sliding home. Okay, so we're all in position. Now we can put our 4 bolts back on. We can reconnect the gear shift lever. Make sure it's in the same position it was when we took it off. And that's pretty much our service complete. Okay, so when we want to reconnect this, make sure we have this this nut, the adjuster nut, in the position that we had it in when we removed it. We're just going to hold the leg of the motor up. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to nip it up a little bit. Okay, once we've got our drive shaft and everything back together, we're just going to tighten up these 2 nuts. Hold one, spin the top one, until we're nice and snug. Tighten the lock nut back up again so that it doesn't move. Once you've done that, you want to check that you have all gears. So whether that's neutral, sorry, that's reverse, neutral, and forward. Just check that everything works properly. Spin the drive shaft. Check when you spin reverse that it goes in, and when it's in forward it goes in. Okay, and that's your bottom leg reinstalled. Okay, if you have a grease gun, you should apply some grease into your grease nipples. Also on the tiller shaft up here. Of course, these being on a catamaran, they won't be steering as such, but certainly if you're using it as a tiller steer, you should grease them up. But also, it helps keep out the corrosion and the water. I always put a little bit of grease on my starter motor, only because I've had these starter motors bind up occasionally, because as you can see there's a little bit of rust on there. So I put a little bit on there. I will give that a little bit of a wipe off because there's a little bit too much on there. That just helps to keep everything nicely lubricated. So there you have one fully serviced Yamaha 9.9 high thrust outboard motor. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. I'll be putting more videos on with my Seawind 1000 sailing adventures as well as maintenance.